I'm a Kashmiri by birth. My parents are both Kashmiris, but I didn't grow up in Kashmir. And but I used to go back every summer, and every summer till 1989. And then once the trouble started, from 89 for 14 years, I didn't go back. Okay, till 2003, which is quite interesting because I'm not sure. Of course, I knew things were bad, and my family who were in Kashmir, many of them had moved out. But I think I just didn't. I blanked it out. I was not. I was not paying attention to it. It was just one way of dealing with it. When I went back in 2003, I have to say that I was very, very shocked by what I saw, uh, which was basically just the level of militarization. Uh, I mean, I lived in Delhi and I thought I knew about what's going on there. I read several papers, I used to watch television, but it was a rude shock. But equally, I think when I went in 2003, I was an older person. I think my own politics had also changed by then. So I was looking at what was happening in Kashmir in a very different way. And I found that nobody was telling that story, you know. And it's not that I was the chosen one, but I said, how can we not tell this story, and how can we not tell this story in a complicated way, like I said to you earlier. Um, I think that I think that what you asked me just now is absolutely right. I think that um, Kashmir has sadly um, seen two things happening simultaneously. One is that on the one hand, the what was once an armed militancy which had a certain amount of support has now become a very small armed militancy with enormous local support. You know, I think that even if we look at the last 20-25 years, that's a whole generation, of people who were born 20-25 years ago. I think that if there was a lack of political clarity in the early 90s, today that political clarity is there. People certainly know where they stand, what they want. So you may not agree with it, but you can't say that you don't know what you want. People are pretty clear what you want. And I think one of the failings of the Indian media, of our liberal and progressive intellectuals, is this inability to hear what people are saying. Because you think you know what they're saying, you have an opinion on it, but actually you're not listening to what people are saying. You're just putting on to them what you think is the situation. So I think that um, sadly, even as this level of political understanding and mobilization has become quite widespread, India has changed considerably, and Kashmir has always had a role to play in the politics of mainstream India, particularly of the right wing, particularly in Hindutva politics, as a kind of something that you can pick up and wave every time you want to have an issue. But in the last 5 years or so, increasingly, I think we find that it is becoming. I keep saying it's become the new Babri Masjid. You know, it's because whenever you want to galvanize mainstream, let's say, Hindutva opinion in the Indian subcontinent, you start talking about Kashmir. And what happens then is that the chances of having a real conversation get even smaller. So, on the one hand, you have a kind of sharpening and a hardening of political opinion within Kashmir. And on the other hand, you have a country which is unable to listen to what people are saying. You know, I know that, you know, I've worked on a film between 2004 and 2007, and coincidentally, 2008 was a year of massive public protest, 2009 was a year of massive protest, 2010 was huge protests, which marked a very big change. You know, those 3 years marked a very big change in Kashmir, because until then, uh, the, whatever the movement was, it was either with the armed guerrillas or it was underground, you know, people. But in 2008, 9 and 10, people came out onto the streets and the weapons moved back, you know, the armed militancy moved back. So it was an opportunity in which India could have had a conversation with Kashmiris, you know, because now weapons were not in the fray. You had non-violent protests going on. You could have found a way of having a conversation, whatever direction it had to take. That didn't happen. And this kind of brief period of opening out now has been met by the opposite. You know, this kind of hyper masculine, get tough with Kashmiris. But it's not working, you see. I mean, if you just look at the accounts of, let's say, the last year, you know, in a week, there are at least one or two encounters between the security forces and militants. 2 or 3 or 4 militants will die, 1 or 2 soldiers will die. Invariably, the militants who die are Kashmiris. They're not Pakistanis anymore. And invariably, when they are surrounded, villagers will come from miles around and literally throw themselves between the security forces and the surrounded militants. Now, this is if anybody was really concerned, they would take this very, very seriously, you know, not by firing pellet guns into that crowd and then injuring more people and blinding more people and creating more anger. You know, so what you have is that, of course, yes, there are only a small number of armed people, armed militants, but there is a tremendous amount of support for them. And if you do believe in a that you know, if you do believe that you have to listen to people, then you have to read those signs. You know, when 3,000 villagers come and surround a house and literally come between the army and the militants, then you have to understand that those militants represent something more than what you think it represents. So I think that we've entered into a very difficult phase, and we are now speaking in 2019. I was in Kashmir a few weeks ago, and I have never found the mood as dark as I find it now. You know, it was a little bit like this when I went in 2003, and now 16 years later, I find it as dark. People are very concerned. People are tired. That does not for a moment think that the way the Indian government likes to think that, oh, people will get tired, and if you squeeze them, then, you know, when people get tired and desperate, then they do desperate things, you know. They don't always surrender. So, I mean, it is a very worrying time. And yeah, I actually am very, very concerned about what will happen in the coming years. Somehow, in the last 5 or 10 years, we seem as a society to have developed a huge threshold for cruelty. You know, see what has been going on in Kashmir in quiet and subterranean ways has been going on for a long time. You know, it's only now, because of social media, because of cell phone cameras, that if a man is tied on top of the bonnet of a jeep and driven through villages, you will see an image. Or if boys are being thrashed somewhere, you'll see a video of it. It's only now that a few exceptional human rights groups are able to produce, like has been done recently, a detailed report on torture, but it's been going on for a long time, and it just needs, in Kashmir, if you go to any village and sit in any house, and in fact, people there don't even use the word torture, they use the word interrogation, and when someone says he was interrogated, it means torture, but they don't use that word. But you have to see what's happening there in the context of what's happening even outside of India. Tell me, in the last few years, we have seen so many images of lynchings, of people being brutalized, or being Dalits being beaten, uh, Muslims being picked upon and, lynched over cow slaughter. I think in general, our threshold to see someone else's pain has gone up a great deal. And sometimes I worry what the media does, what the social media does. When I see a video, does it make me feel bad? Or do I then think, okay, oh yeah, I've seen this kind of video before, it's no big deal, Whereas what I'm seeing is something horrible, but it makes you thick-skinned. But I also believe that what has been cultivated in Kashmir, a kind of violence, and of course that also has its roots in an earlier period. It has that was cultivated earlier in Nagaland and Manipur, where those histories were never told. Very violent histories. I mean, I often say this, that Kashmiris have a middle class, and that middle class has been able to tell its stories to the outside world. What happened in the 60s in Nagaland or Mizoram was that those stories never got told, because there wasn't somebody to play that role. But that violence which we have condoned and practiced, somewhere it's a rot, and that rot cannot stay within Kashmir. It's going to come out, the CRPF soldier or the army soldier or the army officer or the police officer who has to be part of this violence on a daily basis for years on end. Are you going to tell me that when that soldier comes on leave to his village in Kerala, that he will leave it at the Banehal Pass, or at Delhi airport, we carry it within us, I once heard the Ashish Nandi, speak about torture, and he said that, when torture finishes, there are not just the two people in the room, the person being tortured and the person who's doing the torturing, but there is also the family of the man who's doing the torturing, because at the end of the day, he puts on a clean shirt and he goes home, What does he do there? What does he say there? So I think that, sadly, can you see anybody in government in the times that we live in being concerned about this? No, but it is a kind of psychotic behavior. There have been hundreds of films and dozens of books about the consequences of Vietnam on American life. And what was that? That American soldiers were exposed to extreme violence in Vietnam, and they carried that thing back to the US. So in the same way, I really feel that the violence that we are encountering in Kashmir, it is not going to end only there, that it does get carried out. I was seeing recently, it was the anniversary of the Battle of Normandy in World War II. And there was an interview with a very old, he must have been 97 or 98-year-old soldier. And the quote below his picture said that you made killers out of us all. like while everybody was celebrating this great victory of the Allies against the Germans, this man who had been a young soldier on that beach, what he chose to talk about was the brutalization. So I think that I I know that we live in a time when to talk about these things makes you either liable for sedition or you're seen as an anti-national, and we live in a time when those kinds of brutalities are celebrated rather than being sources of anxiety, you know. And we live in highly militarized times where, military victory seems to be the most important thing that we celebrate in this country anymore. But that doesn't change the fact that underneath all that flag waving and so on, I think there is a quite a deep crisis which is brewing. One of the things that I think about all the time is about the position of the Kashmiri Pandits in Kashmir. And because, how do you understand your own position vis-a-vis your own family and how you have encountered a place? And obviously, all of us need to go beyond that. And one of the problems when I was working on a film there was that I wasn't comfortable with my understanding of what had happened. You know, all we know is that yes, between let's say February 1990 and 1998, over a period of 7 years, Kashmiri Pandits left the valley. Some, like my family, already had one foot in Delhi. So it just meant that now they were not coming back in this summer, but they were staying on. Some other relatives lost a lot, property, homes, they left, they were badly affected. And some people suffered violence, all that is there. But at the same time, there was never any of the explanations that I heard never fully satisfied me. You know, like there are always a multiple set of explanations for why the Kashmiri Pandits fled. Somebody would argue that they left because the government helped them to move or encouraged them to move. Somebody else will argue that they left because they were victims of genocide and killings and so on. And neither of the stories was fully made sense to me. And when I was working on my film, every trip I made to Kashmir, because I shot over a long period of time, and I came back with material, I would discuss with my editor and say, like, how do we deal with the Kashmiri Pandit issue? And ultimately, I remember, about 8-10 months into the production of the film, he turned to me one day and he said, listen, why are you trying to force this? These might be two separate narratives. And why are you trying to force one into the other? Why don't you let it be like what it seems to be right now, which is like a big gaping hole? And eventually that's what we did. We used the work of a poet who I call up on the phone and I talk to him about, it's a poem of nostalgia. And I knew that people would be upset with me, as they were. But the interesting thing was that many of those people were upset with me and my film even before they had seen the film. Because the moment it became clear that I didn't have the position that was expected of me, and that expected position has only one dimension, which is to say that in 1990, all Kashmiri Muslims went crazy and they became jihadis and they pushed the Kashmiri Pandits out. There were rapes and killings and murders and so on and so forth. Now, this was not the way I had encountered it. This was not true, according to me. I mean, if you were to just look at killings, when you use words like genocide and pogrom, I mean, the fact is that nobody has been able to prove that, let's say, more than 300 or 350 Kashmiri Pandits died, at a time when maybe 20,000 or 25,000 Kashmiri Muslims died in that same period, if we were to take between 1990 and 98, civilians. They were not militants, civilians. So somehow I was unable to sort of, selectively look at the material. Now, 15 years down the line, I think I'm beginning to understand. I think I can even speak about it, because I think that one of the things I learned was that each of those explanations was true. And it depends on where you're standing from, you give it how much weightage you want. You know, of course, there was violence, people died, there was enormous amounts of fear, there was insecurity. But it's also true that there was panic and people fled, and the government of the moment was not inclined to stem that panic, because at that time that panic and that fleeing helped the government of the day in order to sell a certain narrative about what was happening in Kashmir. So it's complicated, There's also a prehistory, you know. I mean, much though many people, especially on the right wing, and you know, would like to believe that the problem in Kashmir happened on 19 January 1990. After all, Kashmiri Pandits have been living there for centuries, They think of themselves as the original inhabitants. How can you ignore that past history, of what was their relationship with Muslims, how much of invisibilization had they been part of, There's a very famous anthropological work done in a Kashmiri Pandit village by a very, very important Indian anthropologist who also happens to be a Kashmiri Pandit. It's a book which has been celebrated and written about two adjoining Kashmiri Pandit villages, and he never mentions the Kashmiri Muslims, even though the Kashmiri Pandits are a tiny minority in that village. So what I'm trying to tell you is that this is the problem of invisibilization. When you are so focused on your own identity that you're unable to see what happens around you, I may have been a victim of it myself. Like I told you, I went in 1989. I traveled around the valley, I trekked. Because I was largely in touch with my family, and they are all Kashmiri Pandits, I had no idea what was happening around. I mean, by December 1989, Kashmir was in flames. But the Kashmiri Pandits were disconnected from that at a time when everybody knew that something was happening, So, there is no such thing as inevitability, that it was inevitable that this kind of situation would arise. But it is also true that the insularity of the Kashmiri Pandits through the turbulence of the 70s and the 80s in Kashmir did mean that they were out of touch with what was going on around them, And did they deserve to be pushed out? No, of course not. And I think that the migration of the Kashmiri Pandits is a terrible tragedy for them, of course, but for Kashmir also, And many people will acknowledge that in Kashmir because, diversity is what makes a place interesting, and they did provide a kind of diversity to it. One thing I do want to say is that there are Kashmiri Pandits who continue to live in Kashmir. They're a very tiny population, probably not more than 5,000. And interestingly, they're not all living in the city or in one locality. They're scattered. So when I travel in rural Kashmir, you will find somewhere some old couple living somewhere, or some guy running a shop in a village, or somebody, And these are people who've never left. So who are the people who left? Who are the people who could leave? Who are the people who suffered from the migration? And who are the people who were helped to move on? These are, all complicated things. But the most important point that I want to make is that the migration of the Kashmiri Pandits in the early 90s coincided with a very, very large Hindutva push in India. And sadly, the Kashmiri Pandits left the Kashmir Valley and landed straight into that. So whether they landed in Jammu or they landed in Delhi or they landed in Pune or they landed in wherever they went, that was the political formation that eagerly received them. And uh, and that association they have never been able to disentangle from, assuming they wanted to. Uh, do I see myself in a hopeless minority amongst Kashmiri Pandits? I think so. But then, for the kinds of politics that we practice, we are in a hopeless minority wherever we are. I mean, even on some issue which is not connected to Kashmir, one's views are a hopeless minority within the larger context of, say, India also. So by itself, being in a hopeless minority is not a problem. But I also know that very few of the right-wing Kashmiri Pandit uh, intellectuals, uh, they don't debate with me either. It's as if I don't exist. Because I think they're probably concerned that, when I showed my film initially in Delhi and some of them came and protested, I said, I'll do a screening just for young Kashmiri Pandits. Let me show you my film and we'll talk. Nobody ever wanted that because they don't want that conversation. They want a tight box to be drawn around the conversation. They want the conversation to be frozen in some version of the truth which was there in 1990 and hasn't changed since. And of course, given the ascendance of Hindutva and the political ascendance of Hindutva today, it's not surprising that those voices are loud and always present. Is there a future? There might be, but it's not going to happen in the ways in which the right wing imagines it to be. I mean, what the right wing would wish is that for everybody in Kashmir to say, oh, we were wrong and we made a terrible mistake and please come back and, lord it over us. That's not going to happen. Everybody went through a very, very traumatic time in the 90s, and everybody in Kashmir continues to go through a traumatic time. Just 2 weeks ago, somebody, a Kashmiri Pandit, came and opened a shop in the heart of Hari Singh High Street in Kashmir. And it was an amazing event because the local newspapers reported it. People, all the shopkeepers from around came and sweets were being distributed. And he's a man who was actually shot at and who had a bullet in his hip. He was shot at in the 90s. And he said, look, I just decided to come back. I admire people like that because they want to be in Kashmir. They love it there. They don't want to die elsewhere. And they've staked everything in coming back. I think that it will work only when people want to do that. You can't, as I say, run with the hares and hunt with the hounds. You can't have a life outside of Kashmir and then say, oh, but it's too dangerous. Or, people come, they stay there, they take the chances like everybody else, So I'm not hopeless, but it will remain a very, very difficult part of Kashmir for years to come. The last 6 months or year actually has been a particularly gloomy time in Kashmir, because it's very clear that there is a new politics in India where they do not have difficulty in thinking of a Kashmir literally without Kashmiris, and that's a very frightening new thing, Whatever whatever my problems with what was happening earlier with Kashmir over the last 30 years, they were trying to cover up and there was a kind of hypocrisy and they would take 2 steps back and 2 steps forward and, there was that kind of thing. But now there is a sort of there's a brutality to the attitude, which I find very worrying. Sometimes you think, okay, it's a posture, it's all about winning an election, but then you realize that uh, Kashmir is so central to the Hindutva project in Kashmir, in India, that it has a value more than just winning and losing elections. You know, um, they do believe that holding on to Kashmir at any cost is central to their self-image. And when you have that kind of sort of extra political uh, imagination, like the Zionists have in Israel, then anything can be done, you know. And so all this talk of meddling with Article 370 or 35A, I think that, you know, for the opposition to say, oh, if you meddle with that, then you are the accession of Kashmir to India is in question and this is be anti-constitutional. I don't think that the Hindutva forces are terribly concerned about constitutional niceties. You know, if they want to, they will. Um, there is there are all kinds of conversations in the air, you know, trifurcation, which is Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh to be separated. There's talk of just population shift, you know, bring in people from outside, change the delimitation of constituencies so that the Jammu province has more seats and therefore has control. Some of it is psyops. It's a way of keeping people in Kashmir on their toes. But I always believe that you have to kind of keep an ear and an eye out that maybe that's what they're planning, you know. And what will the consequences be? All I can say is that I don't think this generation of Kashmiris is going to take that kind of meddling quietly, you know. So anything of that order will only bring more trouble, more violence. Uh, it will also, I think, internationalize the Kashmir issue a great deal. You know, India is a very powerful player in the international scene because it's a powerful market. But, you know, will everybody keep quiet? Will the world watch? What is the dynamic between the United States of America and China over Kashmir going to be? We don't know the answers to this. But yes, certainly that the kinds of things that you're asking me about, I think that um, there is a thought process in India, in the strategic community, where the example of Palestine and the example of Israel and of Gaza and the West Bank is not very far from people. It's there. Even China, you know, the ways in which the Chinese have dealt with their ethnic nationalities, with their Muslims. These are all things that we know that the present government watches with great interest. So, but having said all this gloomy stuff, I also think that I think that we are going to see in Kashmir, um, apart from the violence and the terror and the fear and all that, I think we're also going to see young people trying to imagine a new way out of where they are. And I am personally, I believe that speaking about it, talking about it, um, making a film, writing, whatever it is, these are all ways in which we can all participate in that conversation. And that's the most important thing. I think the 90s were a time of silence in India. I don't believe the present time is a time of silence on these issues. And no matter how dark things are looking right now, there's plenty to do for all of us.